40 feet beneath the surface of Cypress Lake, South Dakota, the darkness swallows everything in sight. The camera lens of a diver cuts through this eerie void, revealing something unsettling. It's September 2023, and the sonar has picked up something massive, something that doesn't belong. As the murk of the water begins to part, metal emerges, a gray Jeep Grand Cherokee, submerged and silent, lying motionless on the lakebed like a tomb. The recovery team's radio crackles with static. We've got a vehicle, license plate visible, and there's something inside. Something. Someone. For 29 years, this Jeep held a secret, hidden beneath the cold waters of Cypress Lake, its engine long rusted, its tires swallowed by mud. But inside, a body, a chilling truth, had been waiting to be discovered, a truth that the killer thought he had drowned forever. Now, we turn back to that fateful night in September 1994, September 18th. A teenager named Jaime Halenol climbs into this very Jeep, borrowing it from his mother for what was supposed to be a short drive. He was 19 years old, anxious, with a heavy weight on his shoulders. He was meeting someone he trusted, someone from his family, someone he believed would help him with a problem. By morning, Jaime was gone, vanished, without a trace. The police closed the case within 3 days, labeling him a runaway. But Jaime Halenol didn't run. He wasn't fleeing from anything or anyone. He had been murdered, and the man who pulled the trigger thought he had gotten away with it. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried. Before we dive into how Jaime's body ended up 40 feet underwater, you need to understand who Jaime Halenol was. Not just another missing person statistic, not just a cold case file, but a real person, a kid with a future that was tragically stolen. Jaime Michael Halenol was only 19 years old in 1994. He had his mother's dark eyes and his late father's steady hands, the kind of hands made for fixing things. He was enrolled at Black Hills Community College, studying automotive technology. But his real education was happening at Halenol & Sons Hardware, the family store that had been a part of Glen Cross since 1967. Jaime wasn't just a student. He was the backbone of the store, the one customers trusted. With grease-stained jeans and a practical mind, he could fix anything from a broken tractor to a leaky pipe. The regulars loved him. Old-timers would stop by just to ask for his advice, and he would spend hours helping them, even if it meant a $2 sale. At the store, Jaime's family came first, especially his mother, Rachel. She was tough, but Jaime made it easier for her after his father died unexpectedly in 1991. Rachel didn't just raise him. She was his best friend, and they shared everything: life, business, dreams. But Jaime's life, full of promise, was about to be shattered. The family was being torn apart by someone they never expected, someone who would destroy their world in ways they never could have imagined. This is the story of Jaime Halenol, the truth hidden beneath the waters of Cypress Lake, and the murderer who thought he had escaped, but never did. If you're new here, we investigate the cases that shake small-town America to its core. Hit that subscribe button to never miss a story that proves the truth always comes to light. And drop a comment. Let us know where you're watching from. So let's dive into what really happened at Cypress Lake that September night. Rachel Halenol was no stranger to hardship. After the sudden death of her husband Thomas from a heart attack in 1991, Rachel, at just 45 years old, found herself thrust into the role of both mother and provider. Widowed with 3 children to care for and the family business to keep afloat, she was forced to become stronger than ever. Every day was a battle, but Rachel rose to the challenge. The weight of it all was heavy, but Jaime, her son, her rock, made things a little easier. In the wake of her husband's passing, Jaime stepped up. He was just 19, but he assumed more responsibility at Halenol & Sons Hardware. Helping his mother manage inventory, liaise with suppliers, and even handle payroll, Jaime became the backbone of the business. To Rachel, he wasn't just a son, he was her best friend. Every morning, before the store opened, they would sit together and have coffee. They'd talk about everything: work, life, and their hopes and dreams. In those quiet moments, Jaime gave Rachel the strength to keep going, the reassurance that they would make it through. Then there was Mila, Jaime's younger sister, just 16 years old in 1994 and a sophomore at Glen Cross High School. If you asked Mila who her hero was, she wouldn't hesitate. Jaime, she'd say, with a look of admiration in her eyes. Jaime wasn't just a brother, he was her protector. He drove her to school, helped her with her homework, taught her how to change a tire, and stood up for her when the school bullies or her bad boyfriends tried to get the best of her. In Mila's world, Jaime was untouchable, invincible. As a family, they had endured the unthinkable. Losing Thomas had nearly broken them, but they held on together, a bond forged in love and resilience. Jaime had become the heart of that family, his loyalty and devotion to his mother and sister unwavering. He had dreams, plans for the future, and an undeniable sense of responsibility that made him an irreplaceable part of the Halenol legacy. But there was Sarah, Jaime's older sister, who was different. At 24, Sarah was eager to leave Glen Cross behind. She had always been distant from Jaime and their mother. She graduated high school and moved to Rapid City, working as a receptionist and dating a string of men that the family never quite approved of. Then, in June of 1994, Sarah married Aaron Lindell. Aaron, 28, was an outsider to Glen Cross. He'd grown up in Rapid City and claimed to work in finance consulting, a vague job description that never seemed to sit right with Rachel. He was polished, well-dressed, and gave the impression of someone who smiled with his mouth, but never with his eyes. Rachel had her reservations about Aaron, but Sarah was in love, or at least she said she was. After their wedding, Aaron moved to Glen Cross to start his new life with Sarah. Small-town life wasn't his style, but he made it work. He joined the Methodist church, attended community barbecues, and fit into the town's social fabric like he had lived there all his life. In early 1994, long before he married Sarah, Aaron approached Rachel with a proposal. Halenol and Sons needed a bookkeeper, someone who could manage the finances and streamline operations. Aaron claimed he had the experience to help. Rachel was hesitant, but Sarah urged her to give him a chance. "He's family now, Mom. Let him help." So Rachel agreed, and Aaron became the store's financial manager. He now had access to everything: the bank accounts, vendor contracts, and payroll records. For a while, everything seemed fine. Aaron was organized, efficient, and kept the books clean. Rachel trusted him, but Jaime was never fully convinced. He had a gut feeling that something wasn't right. The way Aaron deflected questions, the discrepancies in the financial records, little things that didn't add up. Jaime noticed them, and he wasn't the type to ignore things that didn't sit right. But at that point, the family had no idea just how far Aaron's deceit would go. The stage was set for a tragedy that would shake the Halenol family to its core. Glen Cross was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was a small, tight-knit community in South Dakota where the population barely topped 3,200 people. The town had one main street, 2 stoplights, and a diner that closed at 7 p.m. People took pride in their simple, rural lives, spending their evenings at high school football games where the entire town gathered to cheer. If you grew up in Glen Cross, you never had to lock your doors. It was that kind of place. But even in such a small town, secrets have a way of hiding in plain sight. For the Halenol family, Glen Cross had always been home. Jaime, Rachel, and their 2 sisters, Sarah and Mila, were part of the town's fabric. The family's hardware store, Halenol and Sons, had been a cornerstone of the community since 1967. It had started with Jaime's grandfather, who built the business from the ground up. Then, Jaime's father, Thomas, had expanded it into a beloved local institution. Now, after Thomas's sudden death in 1991, the responsibility of running the store and keeping their family legacy alive fell squarely on Rachel's shoulders. Despite the struggles, the Halenols had always found a way to keep going, their bond growing stronger with every challenge. Jaime, more than anyone, had embraced the role of helping his mother run the store, even taking on extra hours to ease her burden. He knew the ins and outs of every tool on the shelves, could identify the right parts for any repair job, and had an innate understanding of the kind of customer service that made a business thrive in a small town. Cypress Lake, just a couple of miles outside Glen Cross, was their escape. The lake wasn't large, but it was deep, and it had always been a quiet place of solace for Jaime, especially after his father passed. Jaime would often drive out there to clear his head, sitting on the hood of his gray Jeep Grand Cherokee, reflecting on his day. It was where he would go to think, to be alone, and to try to understand what came next for him, his family, and the business. The lake was his sanctuary, his spot of peace in an otherwise tumultuous world. Cypress Lake, just a couple of miles outside Glen Cross, was their escape. The lake wasn't large, but it was deep, and it had always been a quiet place of solace for Jaime, especially after his father passed. Jaime would often drive out there to clear his head, sitting on the hood of his gray Jeep Grand Cherokee, reflecting on his day. It was where he would go to think, to be alone, and to try to understand what came next for him, his family, and the business. The lake was his sanctuary, his spot of peace in an otherwise tumultuous world. Aaron Lindell wasn't from Glen Cross. He was an outsider, someone who'd grown up in Rapid City, just an hour's drive away, but far enough to seem like he didn't quite belong in this small, tight-knit community. At 28, Aaron claimed to work in finance consulting, though no one ever really knew what that meant. His polished appearance, sharp suits, and perfectly practiced smile made him come across as someone who belonged in a larger city, not in a small town like Glen Cross. He always seemed to smile with his mouth, but never with his eyes. Something about him just felt off, even if no one could quite put their finger on it. But Aaron had one thing that seemed to work in his favor. He married Jaime Halenol, Jaime's older sister. And just like that, he was family. When Aaron and Sarah tied the knot in June of 1994, he moved to Glen Cross, and with him came an opportunity for him to integrate into the family business. Rachel, Jaime's mother, ran the hardware store after the sudden death of her husband Thomas. It wasn't easy, but she kept things afloat, working long hours to make sure the business didn't fall apart. Aaron, eager to prove himself and fit into his new family, approached Rachel with a proposition. He suggested that the store needed a bookkeeper, someone who could manage the financial side of the business. With his experience in finance, he assured Rachel that he could help streamline operations, keep track of the accounts, and make everything run more smoothly. Rachel, though cautious, was willing to give him a chance. After all, he was now family, and Sarah insisted that he could help. Aaron Lindell became the store's financial manager, gaining access to everything: the bank accounts, vendor contracts, and payroll records. For a while, everything seemed to go according to plan. The books looked clean, and the store's financials appeared stable. But while Rachel trusted him, Jaime didn't. Jaime had always been astute, particularly when it came to the family business. Something about Aaron didn't sit right with him. His gut told him to pay close attention. Jaime wasn't the type to make a scene, but he began noticing small discrepancies in the financial records, numbers that didn't quite add up, vendor invoices that seemed off. Jaime kept his concerns to himself at first, thinking that maybe he was overthinking things. But as the summer of 1994 wore on, the discrepancies became harder to ignore. Aaron had been getting sloppier. The amounts were small at first, $800 here, $1,200 there. But over the course of 8 months, they began to add up. By the end of the summer, Jaime had found something bigger, something that would change everything. He had uncovered that Aaron had been embezzling money from the business, slowly siphoning off funds through fake vendor invoices and altered financial records. Jaime had proof. He wasn't guessing. He knew. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trust. Aaron had wormed his way into the family, ingratiating himself with Rachel and Sarah, all while betraying them. Jaime knew he had to confront him, but he wasn't going to do it in a way that would tear the family apart. He wanted to give Aaron a chance to come clean, to explain. But little did Jaime know, his decision to confront Aaron would be the last one he ever made. Aaron Lindell, the man who had gained the Halenol's trust, was hiding a much darker secret, one that would come to light in the most tragic way possible. And the price of that secret would be Jaime's life. As the summer of 1994 turned into fall, Jaime Halenol's suspicions grew stronger. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions or make assumptions without concrete evidence, but the inconsistencies in the store's financial records were becoming impossible to ignore. Jaime had always been methodical and precise, whether it was fixing a broken pipe or managing the inventory at Halenol & Sons Hardware. He prided himself on being able to keep everything in order, something he had learned from his late father, Thomas, who had built the business from the ground up. But now the business that had been a pillar of the Glen Cross community for nearly 3 decades was showing signs of strain, and Jaime was determined to find out why. The discrepancies started out small, $800 here, $1,200 there, but as the months wore on, the amounts began to add up. Fake vendor invoices, payments made to contractors who had never been hired, and strange financial records that didn't match up with what had been ordered or paid for. Jaime spent countless late nights combing through spreadsheets and bank statements, trying to make sense of what he had found. The more he dug, the clearer it became. Aaron Lindell, the man who had been welcomed into their family, had been embezzling from them. Jaime wasn't just concerned about the money. It was the principle. The trust that had been given to Aaron, the sense of security that came with family. Jaime had always believed that family was everything. It was a bond that should never be broken. But Aaron had broken that trust, and Jaime was determined to confront him about it. He didn't want to make a scene or accuse Aaron without proof, but he knew he couldn't let this go. The family business, the legacy of his father and grandfather, was at risk. More than that, his mother, Rachel, was relying on him to keep things running smoothly. Jaime's conscience wouldn't allow him to stand by and let the theft continue. He had to act. But in his desire to fix things quietly, to give Aaron a chance to explain himself, Jaime never saw the danger looming. On the 17th of September, just a day before he would vanish, Jaime confronted Aaron. It was late in the evening, after the store had closed for the day, when Jaime found himself alone in the back office with Aaron. He had gathered all the evidence, copies of the invoices, the bank statements, the payment records, and he laid them out in front of Aaron. "I found it," Jaime said, his voice calm but firm. "You've been taking money from the store, $47,000 over the past 8 months. Why? Why would you do this?" Aaron, always the smooth talker, didn't flinch. He seemed cool, collected. He didn't offer any immediate explanation, just an empty stare. For a moment, there was silence, the weight of Jaime's words hanging in the air. Then, finally, Aaron spoke. "It's not what you think, Jaime. Let me explain. Meet me tomorrow, somewhere private. I'll make it right. I'll bring the money back." Jaime, ever the optimist, hesitated. He didn't want to destroy his sister's marriage or turn the family against one another. He wanted to believe Aaron's words, to think that this was just a misunderstanding. So Jaime agreed. He'd give Aaron one last chance to make things right, to explain away the stolen money. But deep down, Jaime knew this was more than just a mistake. And what he didn't know was that Aaron's offer to meet the next night wasn't an olive branch, it was a trap. The night of September 18th, 1994, Jaime left home, kissed his mother goodbye, and drove off in his mother's gray Jeep Grand Cherokee, heading for the meeting at Cypress Lake. The place that had once been a sanctuary for Jaime was now about to become the site of his tragic end. September 18th, 1994, was a warm, late summer evening in Glen Cross, South Dakota. The kind of evening when the heat of the day finally broke and the air took on that distinct smell of dust and dried grass. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across Main Street, and the quiet town was preparing to settle into its usual rhythm. But for Jaime Halenol, this night would not be like any other. After spending most of the day helping his mother at the family hardware store, Jaime seemed distracted. Rachel noticed his restlessness. He kept checking his watch, glancing at the phone as though he was waiting for something or someone. When she asked him what was wrong, he simply told her, "I need to handle something, but not yet. I'll explain when I get back." It was an odd response, and Rachel could sense there was something more to the situation, but Jaime reassured her. He kissed her on the cheek and promised, "I'll be back in an hour, Mom." He borrowed the gray Jeep Grand Cherokee, the very vehicle that would soon become the symbol of his tragic end, and drove off into the evening. Rachel waved goodbye, unaware that it would be the last time she'd ever see her son alive. Jaime made his way to the gas station at Mike's Gas & Go, where a young attendant named Dustin Garrett remembered him. Jaime filled the Jeep's tank, paid cash, and seemed calm, though a little distant. He didn't appear anxious or in a hurry, at least not outwardly. Jaime then continued his drive, heading south towards Cypress Lake, a small body of water just a few miles outside of town, where he and his father had often gone fishing together. At the boat launch parking lot near the lake, Jaime pulled in at around 8:35 p.m. The Jeep came to a stop next to a black Ford F-150. Aaron Lindell was already there, standing beside his truck with his arms crossed, waiting. It was a quiet place, isolated and away from the rest of town, perfect for a private conversation, though Jaime had no idea that this meeting would turn deadly. Jaime got out of the Jeep, carrying a folder filled with evidence of Aaron's thefts, $47,000 in embezzled money, backed by fake invoices and fraudulent transactions. He had it all. This was the moment of truth. Jaime approached Aaron, who nodded silently as he motioned toward the water's edge, away from the road. "We need to talk," Jaime said. His voice was calm but firm. They walked down toward the lake, the faint hum of crickets filling the air as the darkness settled around them. The only light came from the fading sunset and the dim headlights of the parked vehicles. It was eerily quiet. Jaime opened the folder and started to go through the invoices, pointing out the discrepancies in the financial records, explaining the extent of the theft. "Aaron," Jaime said, "this is serious. You've stolen nearly $50,000 from my family. I need to know why." Aaron at first said nothing. He just stared at the water, avoiding Jaime's eyes. The silence between them stretched until Aaron finally spoke. His voice was cold, flat, and devoid of emotion. "You shouldn't have looked, Jaime." Jaime's stomach dropped. Something in Aaron's voice sent a chill down his spine. There was no remorse, no guilt, only a sense of finality. Jaime's heart raced. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his calm. "Aaron, I'm trying to help you here. We can work this out, make it right. Just pay it back and we'll figure something out. But you need to come clean." Aaron didn't seem to care. His eyes narrowed as he responded, his tone laced with menace. "Before you ruin my life, before you tell Rachel and she calls the cops, before Sarah leaves me." Jaime shook his head, confused. "This isn't about ruining your life. You stole from us, from my family. You've destroyed our trust. I'm telling Mom tomorrow, Aaron. You need to come clean tonight, or I will." That was when Aaron pulled the gun. A .38 revolver, bought just 2 months earlier at a pawn shop in Rapid City, registered under Aaron's name. Though he would later claim he sold it at a yard sale, there was no record of that sale, just an untraceable weapon now in his hand. Jaime froze. "Put it down," Jaime said, his voice shaking slightly. "We can fix this. You don't have to do this." Aaron's eyes were cold. His face showed no emotion as he pointed the gun at Jaime. "I'm sorry, Jaime," Aaron said, barely above a whisper, as he squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, loud and final, echoing across the still waters of the lake. Jaime staggered back, his hand clutching his chest, blood beginning to soak through his shirt. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The pain was sharp, overwhelming, but it was already too late. He couldn't speak, couldn't cry out. Only a faint gurgle escaped his lips as the life drained from his body. Aaron watched him fall, cold and unmoving, like a predator with no remorse. He didn't panic. He didn't hesitate. He simply grabbed Jaime's limp body, dragged it to the Jeep, and shoved it into the driver's seat. Aaron wiped the door handles clean of fingerprints, making sure no trace of him remained. With Jaime's body in the car, Aaron drove slowly toward the lake's edge, where the drop was steep and the water was deep, perfect for sinking the vehicle and hiding his crime. He put the Jeep in neutral, stepped out of the vehicle, and gave it a gentle push. The Jeep rolled slowly forward, the tires crunching over the gravel, until it hit the water with a splash. For a moment, the Jeep floated, then the front end dipped as water rushed in, sealing Jaime's fate. Within 2 minutes, the Jeep was gone, swallowed by the depths of Cypress Lake. Aaron stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the water. He checked his watch. It was 9:47 p.m. He turned around, walked back to his truck, climbed in, and drove home as if nothing had happened. When he arrived, Sarah was sitting in the living room, watching TV. She didn't ask where he had been or what he had done. She simply greeted him with a quiet, "Where have you been?" "Just needed to clear my head. Drove around for a bit," Aaron said, offering her a kiss on the forehead. He had gotten away with it, or so he thought. The morning after Jaime's disappearance, Rachel Halenol woke up to an empty driveway. Her son, Jaime, had promised he would be back in an hour, but it was now 6 a.m. and he still hadn't returned. The clock ticked painfully as Rachel waited by the phone. She knew something wasn't right. Jaime had never been one to skip out without saying anything, and this time there was no message, no call, just an empty house and a deep, gnawing feeling in her stomach. By now, Rachel's concern had transformed into anxiety. Her hands shook as she dialed Jaime's friends' numbers, one by one. No one had heard from him. She called Sarah, hoping to hear that Jaime had just stayed the night with her. But Sarah didn't know where he was either. As the morning hours dragged on, the panic began to set in. Rachel had already called the police station several times. She'd spoken to Sheriff Tom Brackens, who had been on the force for over 30 years. His response, however, was less than reassuring. "Mrs. Halenol, I understand you're worried," he said, his voice dismissive. "But Jaime is 19 years old. He's legally an adult. Kids his age get stressed out. They take off sometimes. He'll probably come back when he runs out of money or feels better." Rachel tried to explain that this wasn't like Jaime. He wouldn't just leave without a word. She could feel it in her bones. Something had happened to him. But Sheriff Brackens was unconvinced. "It's probably nothing. We'll put out a bolo, be on the lookout for your vehicle. If anyone sees it, we'll bring him home. But it's nothing to be alarmed about. These things usually work themselves out." Rachel left the station feeling dismissed. Her instincts told her otherwise. She knew her son. Jaime wasn't just another teenager running away from home. He had never acted like this before. This wasn't just stress or a teenage tantrum. Something was terribly wrong. By noon, the Glen Cross police had officially labeled Jaime a runaway. The case had already been closed. 3 days, that's all it took for them to move on. But for Rachel, there was no moving on. Not without answers. The frustration built inside her as she sat in her car, driving to places she knew Jaime frequented, his usual hangouts, the gas station, the diner where he sometimes went after work. No one had seen him. No one knew anything. Rachel wasn't ready to give up, but her calls for help were falling on deaf ears. She drove to Sarah's house, hoping for any sign that Jaime had made contact. She knocked on the door, and Sarah answered, her face pale and tired, eyes red from crying. "Mom, what's going on? Have you heard from Jaime?" she asked. "No, I haven't. I called the police, but they're not taking it seriously. They think he's just run off," Rachel said, her voice cracking with the weight of her fear. Sarah had no answers either. "Maybe he's just, I don't know, Mom. Maybe he just needed a break. He seemed stressed out." Rachel shook her head. "No, Sarah, this isn't like him. He wouldn't just leave. Something has happened." As Rachel stood there, with nothing but her worry to guide her, the silence between her and Sarah spoke volumes. Neither of them knew where Jaime was, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. In the meantime, Aaron Lindell, Sarah's husband, stood silently behind them. He didn't say a word as Rachel desperately searched for any clue that could lead her to her son. His calmness struck her as strange, but in that moment, she had no idea how deeply his actions had already altered the course of their lives. By 6 p.m., Rachel was out of options. She called the Glen Cross Police Department again, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Please, you have to do something. My son is missing, and I know something's happened to him. You need to help me find him." Reluctantly, they agreed to issue a more thorough search. But deep down, Rachel knew that the search was half-hearted. The small-town police force didn't have the resources, and Sheriff Brackens had already made up his mind. Jaime was just another runaway teenager. Yet Rachel's belief in her son's innocence and the wrongness of the situation never wavered. She would not stop. She couldn't stop. If they wouldn't search for him, she would. As the days passed and Jaime's absence lingered, Rachel's relentless pursuit for the truth began to feel like a desperate fight against time. Days passed, but the Glen Cross Police Department's investigation into Jaime's disappearance was moving at a glacial pace. Sheriff Brackens had already dismissed Rachel's concerns, and the case was closed under the assumption that Jaime had run away. To them, it was just another case of a teenager acting out, nothing more than a temporary situation that would resolve itself in a few days. The entire department seemed content to let the case sit in the runaway pile, assuming that Jaime would come back when he grew tired of his little rebellion. Rachel, on the other hand, refused to believe this narrative. Every fiber of her being screamed that something far worse had happened to her son. But without the support of law enforcement, she had no choice but to take matters into her own hands. Despite her constant pleas, no official search party was organized. There were no helicopters scouring the skies, no teams of volunteers combing the fields or nearby woods. The lake, only 2 miles from where Jaime was last seen, was never even searched. Even though Rachel had begged Sheriff Brackens and his officers to check Cypress Lake, she was met with nothing but indifference. "They've got a good point about the lake," Brackens had said when Rachel suggested they check. "Fishermen go there every day, and there's no report of anyone seeing anything strange. If he had an accident, someone would have noticed. There's no reason to believe the lake has anything to do with it." Rachel knew the lake well. She knew Jaime loved to spend time there. It was a peaceful spot where he could be alone, think, or just enjoy the quiet. Jaime had often driven there to clear his mind after his father's death, using the lake as a place to reflect, to think about the future. If Jaime had gotten into some kind of trouble, the lake was the first place Rachel expected him to be. But Sheriff Brackens wasn't listening. "We don't have the resources for a full-scale search for a runaway," he had said. "We'll put out a bolo for the vehicle, but beyond that, there's nothing more we can do at this point." Rachel's frustration grew. The police weren't looking for her son. They weren't considering the possibility of foul play. They were assuming that Jaime was just another teenager who needed space. Rachel knew her son wasn't like that. He wasn't the type to vanish without a word. Something had happened, and it wasn't something as simple as running away. While the police dismissed her, Rachel continued to press forward. She printed thousands of missing person flyers, each one bearing Jaime's face, the Jeep's license plate number, and the details of his disappearance. She drove to surrounding towns, to places where Jaime might have gone, places he had visited before, or places that might have been familiar to him. She stopped at gas stations, diners, even homeless shelters, showing people his photo and asking if they had seen him. But every lead, every tip, turned out to be a dead end. In the meantime, Aaron Lindell, who should have been a suspect, remained a figure of concern in Rachel's mind. Something about his calm demeanor, his indifferent attitude after Jaime's disappearance, set off alarm bells in Rachel's head. He never seemed concerned. He didn't ask about Jaime. He didn't seem affected by the fact that his brother-in-law had gone missing. To Rachel, it seemed too easy. But with no proof, no hard evidence, she had no choice but to keep her suspicions to herself. No one else seemed to notice the way Aaron had acted in those early days after Jaime disappeared. No one questioned him. And so the town went on, unaware that the person responsible for Jaime's fate was already hiding in plain sight. The police had missed their opportunity to investigate thoroughly. They had dismissed Rachel's instinct, and with that dismissal, they had allowed the case to go cold. If only they had searched Cypress Lake sooner, if only they had taken Rachel's fears seriously, perhaps the truth could have been uncovered much earlier. But the investigation had been botched from the start, leaving Rachel to search for answers alone. And for 29 years, that's exactly what she would do. Search, never giving up, never losing hope that one day, the truth would rise to the surface. For 29 years, Rachel Halenol's life was defined by uncertainty, heartbreak, and an unyielding quest for justice. Each day, she woke up with the same painful question: where is my son? Every night, she lay awake with the same gnawing ache in her chest, wondering if today would be the day she finally received an answer. The agony of not knowing was compounded by the lack of closure, the sense that Jaime's death had been swept under the rug, dismissed as a mere runaway case by the very authorities who should have fought for him. But Rachel never gave up. She couldn't. In the early years after Jaime's disappearance, she continued to print flyers and search for leads, walking into gas stations, diners, truck stops, and shelters across South Dakota, Nebraska, and Wyoming. She spoke to anyone who would listen, desperately hoping that someone, somewhere, had seen her son. But every lead, every tip, led to a dead end. Jaime's face appeared on countless posters, in newspapers, on TV. People around the country saw his face, heard his name, but no one could provide the one thing that Rachel longed for, the truth. Rachel wasn't alone in her grief. Jaime's sister, Mila, struggled too. At just 16, Mila's world had been shattered by her brother's disappearance. She spent months unable to go to school, unable to eat, unable to sleep. Every night she lay awake, wondering why she didn't ask Jaime where he was going that fateful evening. Why didn't she stop him? Why didn't she just know something was wrong? It was a burden that weighed heavily on her young shoulders, and it would take years of therapy and painful self-reflection before she could even begin to heal. As Mila grew older, the pain transformed into anger. She threw herself into activism, advocating for victims' rights and working with organizations dedicated to finding missing persons. Mila's determination became a beacon of hope for her family, but the toll it took on her was clear. In a way, they were both victims, trapped in the nightmare of not knowing what had happened to Jaime. Meanwhile, Rachel's grief was channeled into her relentless search. Over the years, she hired private investigators, each one promising to help her find Jaime, but each one ultimately falling short. The first private investigator, a retired cop named Dennis Kowalski, worked tirelessly for 6 months, tracking down leads, interviewing Jaime's college friends and coworkers, and even traveling to Colorado and Montana. But in the end, Kowalski told Rachel what she didn't want to hear. If Jaime wanted to disappear, he did a hell of a job, or he's dead. Rachel fired him, not because he was wrong, but because she couldn't accept it. Rachel was unshakable. Even when the private investigators gave up, she didn't. She set up a tip line, printed more flyers, and pushed forward. She believed that every person who called, every lead that came in, might be the one that finally brought her the answer she so desperately needed. Even when the calls turned cruel, when people pretended to be Jaime, mocking her grief for their own twisted amusement, Rachel never stopped. In 1996, when Jaime would have been 21, Rachel hired her second private investigator. This time, it was a former detective named Frank Myers, who spent years tracking down leads and searching for any piece of evidence that might link Aaron Lindell to Jaime's death. But as with the first investigator, the truth remained elusive. The case grew colder with every passing year, and Rachel's health began to deteriorate. Time seemed to slip through her fingers. Jaime's memory became a bittersweet ache, a reminder of a life never lived, of a future stolen in an instant. But Rachel's commitment never wavered. She spent every birthday, every holiday, sitting at the kitchen table, making Jaime's favorite chocolate cake with vanilla frosting, lighting a candle, and talking to him as if he were still there. "I'm still looking, sweetheart," she would whisper. "I'm not giving up. Wherever you are, I'm going to find you." For nearly 3 decades, Rachel's life was consumed by this single mission, to find her son. It became her reason for waking up each morning, even as the years turned into decades. The Halenol family's world may have seemed to go on, but in Rachel's heart, it never did. The pain of not knowing what had happened to Jaime was a constant weight on her soul. Yet, Rachel kept searching, driven by the unshakable belief that the truth would one day surface. "The truth always surfaces," she would say. Even as she grew older, as arthritis and high blood pressure began to take their toll, she refused to let go of the hope that one day, someone would finally find her son. And then, in 2022, after 28 years of searching, Rachel stumbled upon a post on Facebook that would change everything. The post came from a volunteer group called Recovery Reach, an organization made up of amateur divers specializing in cold cases, specifically those involving water-related disappearances. The post featured an image of a submerged vehicle they had recently recovered in Iowa. Rachel's heart stopped as she read the words. They had found someone who had been missing for years. Rachel didn't hesitate. She reached out to the group, explaining Jaime's case and her belief that he might be at the bottom of Cypress Lake. After all these years of chasing false leads and dead ends, she finally found a team willing to believe her, willing to search where no one else had. And in September 2023, they arrived in Glen Cross to begin their search. What happened next was a journey that would uncover the truth about Jaime's disappearance, reveal the darkest secrets about Aaron Lindell, and finally bring Rachel the answers she had spent 29 years seeking. But the answers Rachel had waited for came with both relief and profound sorrow. The truth, as it always does, would surface. Meanwhile, Rachel's grief was channeled into her relentless search. Over the years, she hired private investigators, each one promising to help her find Jaime, but each one ultimately falling short. The first private investigator, a retired cop named Dennis Kowalski, worked tirelessly for 6 months, tracking down leads, interviewing Jaime's college friends and coworkers, and even traveling to Colorado and Montana. But in the end, Kowalski told Rachel what she didn't want to hear. If Jaime wanted to disappear, he did a hell of a job, or he's dead. Rachel fired him, not because he was wrong, but because she couldn't accept it. Rachel was unshakable. Even when the private investigators gave up, she didn't. She set up a tip line, printed more flyers, and pushed forward. She believed that every person who called, every lead that came in, might be the one that finally brought her the answer she so desperately needed. Even when the calls turned cruel, when people pretended to be Jaime, mocking her grief for their own twisted amusement, Rachel never stopped. In 1996, when Jaime would have been 21, Rachel hired her second private investigator. This time, it was a former detective named Frank Myers, who spent years tracking down leads and searching for any piece of evidence that might link Erin Lindell to Jaime's death. But as with the first investigator, the truth remained elusive. The case grew colder with every passing year, and Rachel's health began to deteriorate. Time seemed to slip through her fingers. Jaime's memory became a bittersweet ache, a reminder of a life never lived, of a future stolen in an instant. But Rachel's commitment never wavered. She spent every birthday, every holiday, sitting at the kitchen table, making Jaime's favorite chocolate cake with vanilla frosting, lighting a candle, and talking to him as if he were still there. "I'm still looking, sweetheart," she would whisper. "I'm not giving up. Wherever you are, I'm going to find you." For nearly 3 decades, Rachel's life was consumed by this single mission, to find her son. It became her reason for waking up each morning, even as the years turned into decades. The Halenol family's world may have seemed to go on, but in Rachel's heart, it never did. The pain of not knowing what had happened to Jaime was a constant weight on her soul. Yet, Rachel kept searching, driven by the unshakable belief that the truth would one day surface. "The truth always surfaces," she would say. Even as she grew older, as arthritis and high blood pressure began to take their toll, she refused to let go of the hope that one day someone would finally find her son. And then, in 2022, after 28 years of searching, Rachel stumbled upon a post on Facebook that would change everything. The post came from a volunteer group called Recovery Reach, an organization made up of amateur divers specializing in cold cases, specifically those involving water-related disappearances. The post featured an image of a submerged vehicle they had recently recovered in Iowa. Rachel's heart stopped as she read the words. They had found someone who had been missing for years. Rachel didn't hesitate. She reached out to the group, explaining Jaime's case and her belief that he might be at the bottom of Cypress Lake. After all these years of chasing false leads and dead ends, she finally found a team willing to believe her, willing to search where no one else had. And in September 2023, they arrived in Glen Cross to begin their search. What happened next was a journey that would uncover the truth about Jaime's disappearance, reveal the darkest secrets about Erin Lindell, and finally bring Rachel the answers she had spent 29 years seeking. But the answers Rachel had waited for came with both relief and profound sorrow. The truth, as it always does, would surface. The diver, Tessa Briggs, suited up and prepared to descend into the cold, dark waters. The dive team was experienced, having recovered vehicles and remains from lakes and rivers before, but every recovery was different. This time, the stakes were much higher. Tessa rolled into the water, disappearing below the surface. The wait felt agonizing, each second stretching longer than the last. Minutes later, Tessa's voice crackled through the radio. "I see it. It's a vehicle. I'm approaching. It's the Halenol Jeep. I can see the license plate." Rachel gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "Is it really him?" she whispered, not even daring to believe it. "License plate confirmed. This is the vehicle. We have the remains inside." Tessa's voice came through, steady but filled with the weight of the discovery. Rachel's hands trembled as tears blurred her vision. Jaime, it's really him. After all these years, after everything, Jaime's body had been found. The team continued the recovery process, carefully extracting the Jeep and its contents. It was a painstaking process, as the vehicle had been submerged for nearly 3 decades, but eventually, the Jeep was brought to the surface. Inside, Jaime's remains were found in the driver's seat, still buckled in, his body skeletal and decayed after so many years underwater. It was a bittersweet moment. Jaime was finally home, but the truth of his fate was sealed. The Jeep was transported to a secure garage in Rapid City for further forensic analysis, where the cause of death was confirmed, a gunshot wound to the chest. The bullet, a .38 caliber round, was still lodged in Jaime's body. His death had been quick but brutal, and now, after all this time, the evidence was undeniable. Aaron Lindell had killed Jaime and left his body to rot at the bottom of Cypress Lake. News of the recovery spread like wildfire. The small town of Glen Cross, which had once written off Jaime's disappearance, was shaken. Jaime Halenol, whose name had been forgotten by many, was now at the forefront of the conversation. His case was no longer just another unsolved mystery. The truth was out. As the investigation shifted from a missing persons case to a full-fledged murder investigation, Rachel's focus turned to one person, Aaron Lindell. The man who had been welcomed into their family, the man who had stolen their trust, had also stolen Jaime's life. For 29 years he had lived freely, pretending to be someone else, hiding in plain sight under a new identity. But now, the truth had finally surfaced. Aaron Lindell was the murderer, and his days of freedom were over. The following weeks were a whirlwind as the South Dakota Division of Criminal Investigation took over the case. They dug deeper into Aaron's past, discovering his fake identity and the years he had spent evading justice. As the evidence against him mounted, it became clear that Aaron Lindell had thought he would get away with murder, but he had underestimated one thing: Rachel Halenol's unrelenting pursuit of the truth. On the 28th of September, 2023, Aaron Lindell was arrested in Bloomington, Indiana, where he had been living under the name David Morrison. His capture marked the end of a long and painful chapter for Rachel and her family. When Aaron was brought to trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Jaime's remains, the murder weapon, the financial records linking Aaron to the crime, everything pointed to his guilt. Aaron Lindell had taken Jaime's life to cover up his theft, and for 29 years, he had lived in the shadows, hoping the truth would never come to light. But the truth always surfaces. On November 17, 2023, the jury found Aaron Lindell guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rachel Halenol finally had the justice she had spent nearly 3 decades fighting for. For Rachel, the journey didn't end there. She established the Jaime Halenol Scholarship Fund to support students pursuing degrees in criminal justice, forensic science, and victims advocacy, fields that could help prevent tragedies like Jaime's from happening again. Jaime's legacy lived on, not just in the scholarship, but in the reforms that followed. Jaime's law was passed in South Dakota, requiring mandatory search protocols for all missing person cases and ensuring that no family would ever have to endure the same kind of neglect that Rachel had faced. And as Rachel stood at the memorial that was erected at Cypress Lake, the place where her son's body had been found, she whispered, "I found you, baby. I never stopped looking." Jaime Halenol, who had been lost for 29 years, was finally home. The truth had surfaced, and justice had been served.